Erev Tov Rabotai, we're continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Maasrot. We're up to Parakeh Mishnah Zayin. Today's Mishnayot should be Le'ilun Nishmat, Neria ben Svetlana, Aranbai, and Eliyahu ben Burcha Israelov, Menuchatam beGan Eden. Amen. Today's Mishnah is going to discuss a case where grain kernels were found in ant holes. The Mishnah says, Chorea Nemalim, if grain kernels were found in the holes of ants, Shelanu Betzad Arema Chayevet, that they spent the night next to a pile of grain that is subject to Maasrot, even if they are in a field that also contains other grain that is not yet subject to Maasrot, these kernels are subject to Maasrot. And the Mefarshim explain that the term arema refers to a pile of grain that was not smoothed down, and it will never be smoothed down, like we learned in chapter 1, Mishnah 6, that such a pile is considered fully processed and subject to Maasrot. Now, the Mefarshim point out the reason the Mishnah said that they spent the night next to a pile of grain is because that's usually when ants collect their food. The halakha would be the same if the ants were seen next to the pile during the daytime. And again, we said even if they're in a field that also contains other grain that is not yet subject to Maasrot. So, for example, in addition to this pile, let's say the field also has a larger amount of grain that was not yet processed and is not subject to Maasrot, we say these kernels are subject to Maasrot. And the Mishnah says, Shiadua shemidavar gamu gorin kol halayla, because it is certain that the ants were dragging kernels from the pile of fully processed grain the entire night, because since that pile was right next to their hole, we can be sure that they took the kernels from there and not from somewhere else. Now the Mefarshim point out, if we were unsure where these kernels came from, we would apply the principle of rov majority, which teaches us that if you have an item of an unknown origin, we assume it comes from the place where most of those items are. The Gemara in Baba Batra, page 23b, which is known by the Mefarshim, say, Kol de parish, miru beparish. Anything that separates, we say it separates from the majority. That's if you're unsure. But in this case, if we would be unsure, it would end up being that we would say the kernels were from the larger amount of unprocessed grain scattered throughout the field. However, here, there's no doubt about where these kernels came from, because the Mishnah says we can be sure that the ants didn't ignore the grain that was closest to them and processed in order to take the grain that was farther away and unprocessed. That's why we say these kernels are subject to Maasrot. That is in Rabotai Mishnah Zayin. Mishnah Chet now moves on to discuss produce that grows ownerless in the wild is not subject to Maasrot, like we said in chapter 1, Mishnah 1. The Mishnah is going to list a number of types of produce that are exempt from Maasrot for this reason. The Mishnah begins Shum Bal Bechi. This is the halakha for Lebanese garlic, which Mefarshim explain a variety of garlic native to Lebanon, and Baal Bechi is a town in Lebanon's Bekaa Valley, which Mefarshim tell us. Ubatzal shirichpa, onions from Richpa, which is, Rav says, a specific type of onion that usually grows in a place called Richpa. Ugrisina kilkin, Cilician split beans, which again the Rav says are square-shaped beans that are native to the province of Cilicia. The Hadashim Mitzrayot, in Egyptian lentils, which was a variety of lentil that was common in Egypt. Rabbi Meir says afa karkas, also karkas, which is a type of cabbage. Rabbi Yossi says afa kutnim, also kutnim, which is a type of lentil. Piturim min Maasrot. These species are all exempt from Maasrot, because since people do not usually plant these species, it can be assumed that they grew on their own in the wild and are not obligated in Maasrot. The Mefarshim do point out, however, if a person knows for certain that a particular one of these plants was in fact grown by someone, then the plant would be obligated in Maasrot. Now the Tana Kama holds that these last two species, Karkas and Kutnim, they cannot be assumed to have grown in the wild. He disagrees with Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi. The Mishnah now is going to teach us another halakha about these species. Produce that grows on its own during Shemitah must be made freely available for anyone to take. The owner may not guard it. So if produce was guarded, it cannot be bought. The Mishnah discusses now how to apply this to the species that we just said. These species may be purchased from anyone during Shemitah, even from someone who's suspected of selling produce that was unlawfully guarded, because even though we're not allowed to buy most forms of produce from such a person out of concern that he guarded them, these species can be assumed to have grown ownerless in the wild and not in a guarded field. The Mishnah continues on to discuss only produce that is edible is subject to Maasrot, like we learned in chapter 1, Mishnah 1. The Mishnah now is going to list a number of seeds that are exempt from Maasrot because they are not edible. Zera luf ha'elyon, seed of the wild luf, which the Rav says is a type of onion that usually grows in the wild. Now the Mishnah, the Mefarshim say the Mishnah doesn't mean to say that this particular onion grew in the wild, because then the seeds would be ownerless and exempt from Maasrot even if they were edible. But the type of onion generally grows in the wild. zera kreshim, leek seeds, zera bitzalim, onion seeds, zera lefet, utznorot, turnip, and radish seeds, ushar, zerone, ginash, nechalim, and other garden seeds that are not eaten, piturim min Maasrot, they are all exempt from Maasrot because they are not edible. However, the Mefarshim do say seeds that are edible, like the seeds of garlic and cress, they are subject to Maasrot. And these seeds may be purchased from anyone during Shemitah, even from someone who's not trusted to observe the laws of Shemitah, because edible leaves are not subject to the laws of Shemitah, like the Rambam tells us in Hilchot Shemitah, chapter 5, Halakha 21. And the Mishnah concludes that although these seeds are not subject to Tirumot and Maasrot, if they were designated as Tirumah, they must be treated as Tirumah. They're not actual Tirumah, but the rabbis decree that they should be forbidden to a non-Kohen. The Mishnah now discusses a case where these seeds were designated as Tirumah and then planted. If these inedible seeds were designated as tirumah and then planted, if vegetables grew from them, even though the fathers of the vegetables, the seeds from which they grew, are tirumah, the vegetables are not tirumah and they may be eaten by a non-Kohen, because although usually something that grows from tirumah has the status of tirumah, that's only when the original tirumah is edible. Since these seeds aren't edible, the vegetables that grow from them do not have the status of tirumah. And the Mefarshim explain the law that something that grows from tirumah must be treated as tirumah is only a rabbinic law, a decree. It's the Rabbanan. If you look in Mishna Yomi, Masechet Tirumah, chapter 9, Mishnah 4. Since these seeds are themselves only tirumah midrabbanan, the rabbis didn't apply them the extra decree that whatever grows from them is also tirumah. And that is in Rabotai of Perek Hey Mishnah Chet, and that is in Rabotai of Masechet Maasrot Mishnayot. Chazak u'baruch, Baruch Adonai le'olam, Amen v'amen.